All right. Good morning, Catholic YouTube. Brian, back with you on this Monday morning for another installment of Eugenics and Contraceptives for your edification and your entertainment. My plan was really to have this be the last one, but as I got my notes together, I'm looking at it and I'm like, this is just way too much for just one more lecture. So, the way all things are looking is that it's probably going to continue at least until one more. What have we got? I kind of count the Scopes Monkey trial as like a little addendum to this. So at least one more. Greetings from Bohemia, my friend. I was just telling my wife the other day that at heart I am a Bohemian. So greetings, brother. So yeah, at least one more is what I'm thinking. We're good. We'll see how it goes. We'll see what I get through today. All right. So if you were with us last week, and if you weren't with us last week, I really advise that you go back and watch the previous. I haven't set this up where it's like kind of, maybe it's kind of a standalone lecture, but the idea is that you are familiar with where we have come from so far. And I don't really want to rehash all of that right here, but I do want to step back just a little bit from where we ended last week. Last week I said we were kind of right up to the doorstep of how the contraceptive movement plays into the eugenics movement. But again, I want to step back here just for a second, maybe smell the roses for a minute before we go in. So we have established that the powers that be, from the financial sector to the political sectors to the scientific sectors, all these various groups were basically in agreement that society was increasing at an alarming rate, and that the ones who were reproducing were overwhelmingly unfit to do so, and that measures had to be taken to quell this, to put an end to this. And it's kind of here at this juncture that we begin to see a real fracture and disagreements, as it tends to happen with these sort of things. Like new ideologies come around, and it's sort of like a common denominator that people sort of gravitate to. And as the idea kind of comes to fruition, you start to see these groups kind of fracture apart. It happens over and over and over again. We could go through countless examples of this right on up to our own day. Men like Rockefeller at the time and members of the American Eugenics Society, these guys advocated for and pushed through and got laws passed that were designed and set up to forcibly sterilize those deemed undesirable, which by and large, as we stated, were African American, Native American, and Latino women. Now, all over the countries as well, these fairs are being held to educate the public on the necessity of quote unquote good breeding. After all, right, Darwin taught us that we're no better than dogs. They're no different, in fact, and that we don't actually have a telos. We don't have an end for which we were made. We don't have a destiny. In fact, man was the maker of his own destiny, and we could through social engineering create races of the equivalent of human Rottweilers and pit bulls. Meanwhile, concurrently to this new ideology of the progressives. Running sort of alongside it was this burgeoning feminist movement. And we will hear, at this intersection of women beginning to get a voice in the public square in this new way of conceptually proposing that women should be involved in society. And they add this kind of like a hushabye baby cooing that women tend to add to conversations that can actually be quite effective at deceiving and calming people, men included, because up to this point, with the exception of some women that were involved in the education and collection of data on families within the eugenics movement, as we said, there were women that were going around collecting data on people so that they could have databases of who we would label undesirable and who were fit. But we hadn't seen women all that active in this new science. It was basically a bunch of men, brutes that we can be, who were sort of blustering forward with guns ablazing, forcing women into clinics to be sterilized. These other women come along and they're like, no, 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 like let's not do it, right? That's you men, you're being too mean, you're being too aggressive, and we need to soften the blow. If we're going to be exterminating masses of undesirable people, we need to like liven it up with some pizzazz and some color. You need a woman's touch. Now, I told you at the beginning of all of this that it was going to get serpentine, right? It was going to get Byzantine, it was going to get Gordian, and trying to untangle the knots. Well, we have to add one more, yet another. Now, as I alluded, you cannot proceed into this next part before we do a quick glance at the rising feminist and women's suffrage movements. Now, a lot of people aren't aware of just how intertwined all of these various groups are. Eugenics and the feminist movements here, for example. Going back when Sir Francis Galton was formulating his ideas of eugenics as a field of study and eventually as a course of action, he really saw women as kind of mere conduits, not offering much to the actual study and the execution of eugenics. They were more just like they were the conduits from which we men were going to be able to produce these new races of men. So he along with the mass group of the men involved in the eugenics movement principally see it being left up to men to be the selectors of the ones who do and do not get to procreate. Now, over time, though, concurrently with this, you have the rise of the feminist movement and the women's suffrage movement who begin gaining traction. And it was seen as a possibly politically expedient move by some to sort of join the two of these together. So what happens is many of your pioneers in the feminist movement were themselves as well staunch supporters of the eugenics movement, and we could name quite a few. You have Victoria Woodall. You have the so-called famous five from Canada who pushed for women's suffrage there. One of them actually stating that it was imperative for English blood specifically, which was, of course, of superior stock to others, to be isolated and preserved from pollution, as she put it. We have none other than Helen Keller herself, the famous deaf, dumb, and blind girl who, because of the wealth of her family, was able to afford specialized teachers who taught the young woman to read and write. Well, she was a candidate for being undesirable had she been born in different circumstances. Well, she was also, because of her circumstances and the education that it afforded her, was an advocate for decreasing human population, stating that we should actually refuse medical intervention for infants who were deemed undesirable because their lives aren't worth the time, the expenditure in manpower and money that these infants required. One character in all of this that's kind of hard to pin down, though she's certainly very consequential to the whole conversation, is Emma Goldman. Emma's kind of a strange bug. She was an anarchist who was idealistically drawn to the totalitarianism of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, if you can maybe wrap your mind around that. Now, granted, we do have hindsight, and when the Bolsheviks took power, if you hadn't worked through Lenin's meticulously detailed explanations of what his plans were, and granted, Lenin is kind of like reading a phone book or a dictionary. It's not the most exciting thing to spend your time reading, but she apparently believed that the Bolsheviks were going to usher in this new era of egalitarianism, and she quickly becomes disillusioned with that. But she advocates for it. She's also an advocate for the early free love movement, which we haven't really mentioned, but it's basically this idea that's very prevalent today of having open relationships, and the it's not necessarily the destruction of marriage as an institution, but the deconstruction of marriage as an institution. She was also a very early proponent of the contraceptive movement and possibly held to some of the eugenics tendencies, though, to be fair, it seems that she emphasized bringing up economically the lower class peoples rather than weeding them out through breeding campaigns. Though we do get comments from her, for example, her Anarchism and Other Essays, where she states, quote, she's talking about Friedrich Nietzsche here, and she says, quote, Friedrich Nietzsche, for instance, is decried as the hater of the weak because he believed in the Übermensch, the overman. It does not occur to the shallow interpreters of that giant mind that this vision for the overman also called for a state of society which will not give birth to a race of weaklings and slaves. So keeping in mind that Emma Goldman's goal, her purpose, is for a social revolution, an entire overhaul of the functionings of state, of man, of ethics. So, in that sense, it seems clear that she at least toys with the idea of eugenicism as being a part of this social overhaul. Now, we're going to come back to Emma. She is a bit of a pivotal figure, but I also need to introduce you to another very important woman named Mary Dennett. Now, guys, I know this series it's been very name heavy, and I apologize for that, but the characters in all of this are actually very important, and the organizations that form around these characters are important as well. And we've been covering the organizations, but I want to get it like I want to get at the roots of these organizations, because organizations are led by people who have formed ideas and opinions, generally speaking, with very specific goals and intentions. And like Goldman, Dennett is an interesting case study. In many ways, Dennett would love modernity. I mean, modernity in the proper sense. Like, she, at least the societal trends since the 1960s, but certainly the hard push in social issues to the left since like the 2010s, she'd be right at home today here in 2024 in many ways. Now, in 1904, her husband leaves the family for another woman, and Mary Dennett, being the sort of strong willed person she was, she files for divorce against him in an act that, while not unprecedented, did cause a bit of a local scandal. So, admittedly, her husband, for all appearances, was a scumbag. This is a guy who has refused, he leaves her for another woman, refuses to help financially with the children that he brought into this world with Dennett, and was, for all intents and purposes, going to leave his wife and his children destitute. So, in response to this unfortunate series of circumstances, Dennett goes out and finds work, and she immediately joins this burgeoning feminist movement. And she becomes a very early proponent of educating children on sexual intercourse, on orgasms, on various forms of birth control methods, including contraceptives, on educating for STDs, all of the things that you would find in a standard middle school curriculum these days, even though I think they've actually lowered the age. I think they want to teach our preschoolers about these things today. As well, she actually advocated for educating children in the normalization of masturbation. So you see where I'm getting at, right? Like she would be very comfortable here in the year 2024. In 1919, she forms the what is it? It's called the Voluntary Parenthood League. I think that's what it was called, for which she sets up to serve her purposes for all of this, for education. And we'll come back to that in a second. But like Goldman, Dennett's work is going to be crucial to what happens next because in 1914, she meets a young woman named Margaret Sanger, who is kind of the main focus of this lecture today. And is Dennett is kind of swept up into Sanger's already at this point underway campaign for the birth control movement. So, New York City in the early 19 teens, Greenwich Village. Now, if you know anything about Greenwich Village, I think all of this stuff today has kind of like lost its initial, what do we say, radicalism and even whatever charm some of these places may have had. Greenwich Village has always been kind of known as this place for, dare I say, I've got my bohemian friend listening today, right? Well, this group of sort of bohemian in that sort of colloquial sense of the word, socialist radicals, like misfits hung out in Greenwich Village. Today, I imagine is probably where you shop at like high-end stores where you pay too much for the stuff that we could get up the street at Target or Walmart. But anyways, at the time, this is what these areas were known for, Greenwich Village. And the people that were hanging out at Greenwich Village in the 19 teens includes Goldman. It includes a man named Moses Harman, an anarchist journalist who published a paper named Lucifer the Light Bearer, later to be changed by him to the American Journal for Eugenics. So you can see already, right, how all of this is related. You've got this anarchist journalist who's publishing this paper that, for all intents and purposes, has satanic ends, as he himself is willing to admit. Wily bohemian anarchist that he is, now, Ezra Haywood is also part of this group, another anarchist advocate who pushed for these free love ideals, as well as he was an early advocate for changing the Gregorian calendar's usage of AD and BC. So if you ever wonder where that comes from, it's from these kinds of groups, right? And now keep in mind, the anarchists of this period were not your like Mohawk skateboarding kids that listened to punk rock that were at worst like, you know, tagging and graffitiing subway walls somewhere, right? These were actually, at times, very violent groups. For example, you have President McKinley assassinated by an anarchist at the turn of the century, 1900, 1901. In 1920, you have the anarchists setting off a shrapnel laced bomb, killing and maiming hundreds of people down on Wall Street. Emma Goldman herself, for years, had been tied with this movement, with these people, including links, well known links to McKinley's assassin. So we're talking a pretty rough group here. Well, in 1912, a young nurse from the Lower East Side, Margaret Sanger, joins the group in Greenwich Village. Now, I want to be objective as possible in all of this, and I feel like I have been so far. I've been kind of diving into each of these groups. I'm not getting polemical. I'm expressing, go back to like Clarence Darrow and William Jennings Bryan in the Scopes Monkey trial, for example, right? There's things that I admire about William Jennings Bryan. There's things that I would vehemently disagree with him on. But when you start getting into this group with this radical feminists and the radical anarchists, it becomes harder and harder to actually find things that you could sympathize with. But I want to, from the outset here, before we start getting really into the critique, say, I'm not going to, and hopefully this becomes clear, I'm not really going to straw man. At times we're up against pretty formidable opponents, even though intellectually some of them are quite weak. But in recent years, there have been challenges against Sanger from her own side, right, for her ideas. But I actually want to cut them down from their philosophical roots, not just make a caricature of what these people believe and then think that we as Catholics can just move on to the next thing. I want to like actually get at what her intended purposes were, and then cut those down, not just the later effects of what come from maybe things that she didn't even have control over. So, Sanger, she's a nurse in the Lower East Side of New York at a very poor hospital, and she's witness to the conditions of the literally poor women in the maternity ward at this hospital. And we're talking some pretty horrid situations and conditions where things like sanitation or even just compassion were in very low supply for these women. Many of the women were forcing self induced abortions due to their own plight. Meanwhile, as Sanger was well aware herself, there were other women in the uptown of the city, affluent women who were granted access to things like contraceptives. Now, right here, I do want to pause again because I say we're not trying to caricature people. And I can say at this point, without moving forward, I can sympathize with the women, certainly in these poor hospitals and in the conditions that they were in. I mean, many of these poor migrant women are coming in from Europe, for coming in from Ireland and Germany and Eastern Europe, places like the Czech Republic or Czechoslovakia or any of your other Slavic areas. And these women were treated at times quite brutally by their employers, by their landlords, by the health, by all around. It's very horrendous conditions. Many of the women are actually thrown into prostitution because they have little other choice. So I feel at times, right, that the right wing, specifically in the US, I can't say elsewhere in the world, but here, at least in the US, so often the right wing wants to, I think, like just own the left, that they can actually be quite pitiless and at times, I think, uncharitable. The left's criticism is that the right often cares less about those in need after the people are born than they do before. And I'm talking here about specifically the secular American conservative right. And there's some truth to that because for the secular American conservative right, the sort of pull yourself up by your bootstraps libertarianism, if I did it, you should be able to do it too. You know, Dorothy Day once said that the Gospels do away with any distinction for us between the deserving and undeserving poor. As Christians, we have no right to turn to a woman that's in a destitute situation and point our fingers at her and wag our fingers. We as Christians have to contend with Christ and what he said. And Protestant conservatism in general, especially on the right, has been at times I feel very unchristian in this respects. And as as Catholics, we need to accept that at times our own have kind of fallen for that trap. So what I'm trying to say here is that I can sympathize with the frustrated worker like Margaret Sanger seeing these conditions and being disgusted with them and wanting to do something about it. I'm sure they were vile, horrendous things that she saw. I'm sure the women were treated, as I said, poor immigrant women often were, as sort of the lowest scum on earth, no better than swine, really. Sanger herself was born to an apostate Catholic family. Her father was, I think, at least by the time that she was cognizant of it, became an atheist. So I'm certain that she's kind of an early example of well, I was raised Catholic, right? You know the people I'm talking about. And I can imagine her father was a part of this emergent trend in the United States Catholic Church of Catholic immigrants coming here and really abandoning the church quite quickly. This has always been a problem for United States Catholics, for those of you that aren't aware. And it actually still exists. It's still a problem for us today. We see, just for example, many Hispanics coming into this country out of South America. And by and large, they're not in droves coming into the Catholic Church. Many of them are actually becoming secularized and indifferent, or at best, like evangelical Protestants are picking them up. So anyway, Sanger is witnessing all of this, and she goes out looking for answers, and she can't find, according to her, she can't find literature on it anywhere. And she notices, hey, these women uptown, these affluent women have access to these things where the poor on this side of town don't. But, and this is where the crossroads is, but instead of calling out the hypocrisy of the upper class and calling them to task, she instead decides that it would be better if the poor had the same kind of access. So do you see here? Do you see like where we would diverge from where she goes? Like standing back and beginning with the premise that you're dealing with these poor immigrant people who are being treated horribly by a system that it just is a amoral at best towards them, often immoral towards them. So we as Catholics could say, yes, that's correct. It's wrong. It's an injustice. It should have been made right. She veers off into this other direction, though. So she opens up a clinic in 1916 with her sister and another radical feminist because she has grander ideas of what she would like to do to fix this solution. And so, for that, to kind of start going after her grander ideas, we have to turn to the Comstock laws. So, at the time in the United States, on the books, going back to the Grant administration, there were these series of acts that were passed in various states that eventually get passed at a federal level with what's called the Comstock Act, which made it illegal to transport obscene materials through the United States Post Office, including, quote, any article or thing designed, adapted, or intended for preventing contraception or producing an abortion, end quote. So that's right, folks. The US government at the time made it illegal to transport contraceptives or information on contracepting through the mail. Now, again, it's such an interesting time in the United States of America. I love this period of time at the turn of the 20th century because it's so insanely different than our own time, but you can like walk the path right to 2024 from some of these things that really begin happening at this point. There are all these competing ideas and groups that are floating around, and see if you can track this with me, right? Like you have let's say you have group A and maybe related on this point with group B. All right. Group A and group B on this particular point may be related to one another. But on another point, they may be unrelated and disagree with each other. But on that same point, the point that group A and B disagree with each other, let's say group A and group C actually agree with each other. But on the point that they don't agree on, that A and B do agree on, let's say B and C may agree on that point, right? So it's very bizarre and convoluted. Maybe just to kind of give you an example here, right? If you go back to like the abolitionist movement, it was deeply influential on the later prohibition movement, all right? The prohibition movement was influential on the women's suffrage movement and the feminist movement. But many of them, especially those involved in the prohibition movement, were not for, let's just say, like, for example, free love. In fact, they could be quite puritanical in their views on sex. Now, some of them in the feminist movement, though, like Goldman, was for the free love movement and also sympathetic to the Bolshevik movement in Russia. So where they join together on this one point, they diverge on another point, right? And then this group over here joins on that point, but they also diverge. That groups over here separate. So it's interesting, right? Because you see the left, especially of this period, struggling with the implications of quote unquote freeing women. Because the intended outcome by many of those in the free love movement was to abolish monogamy in the family, as we've said. And there was this hope, especially that the Bolshevik Revolution would be this harbinger of the change that would take place with the family. But Vladimir Lenin, it's said that he had a mistress, but for the most part, he was always very loyal to his wife Krupskaya. Stalin had a few wives, but he was no libertine. So you quickly see all of them, from Emma Goldman to John Reed, the American journalist that went over to Russia, really becoming disillusioned with the growing puritanical streak within the Bolshevik movement. And eventually, the Soviet left actually does become quite sexually repressive, especially in the views of what was initially hoped for. And all the way up to modernity, where because of the effects of some of the ideology of people like Goldman on Russian society, the family in Russia did start to fall apart. But as a result of that, the population plummeted in Russia, and now you have people like Putin, who are ex-Kremlin guys, struggling to like reestablish and assert the family dominance, because you can't pull the rug out from an institution like the family and not expect demographic collapse. But let me not get too far here. And I'll tell you a funny thing though about all of this is that you see both sides at the time over in Europe. You see the communist Soviets and the Nazi fascists blaming each other for the sexual decadence of the West. The commies said that the decadence in the West was the logical outgrowth of bourgeois culture, where the Nazis said that the decadence of the West was actually a communist Jewish infiltration. But, anyways, yeah, that should give you an idea of how crazy all of this is, and why I say it's kind of a nightmare trying to parcel out different parts and put them together, see who's related to what where and where they aren't related. And I've tried here, maybe I'm even failing at this explanation of trying to see how this stuff is related and unrelated. But my goal is mainly just to kind of push forward the narrative, maybe even like just slightly, for to help some of you, because I really hope that some of you guys actually start taking some of this stuff up. I really do think that we have a good case to be made for the Catholic Church's position and stance on things like contraceptives and where these things were born out of. But anyways, Goldman, Dennett, Sanger, all three of these women wanted to challenge the Comstock laws. Sanger, in particular, is keen to push through laws that allow low income women access to the self sterilization methods that she's pushing for. So they set about to basically self incriminate in order to push the law. They start mailing out series of literature on contraceptives and the birth control movement. It's interesting, actually, that just a little connection here. Clarence Darrow, from our discussion on the Scopes Monkey trial the other day, he actually offers to represent them all for free, just to kind of show you how some of these things are more tied together than what you would realize. In the meantime, they all go on speaking tours. They start educating women on birth control. Dennett, as I said, forms the Voluntary Parenthood League in 1919. Sanger forms the American Birth Control League in 1921. In 1925, Dennett's organization merges with Sanger, and in 1942, Sanger's organization is renamed Planned Parenthood, which is something we all know about here in the States. Now, interestingly, Dennett and Sanger really didn't see eye to eye. And this is where these things I said are really fascinating, because it's like, okay, these people are often tied together, but then they really aren't in all ways. Because, well, I mean, just for example, right, Sanger actually once said of Dennett that Dennett disagreed with Sanger on her methods, her tactics, and basically everything that she was doing. So apparently, Sanger was too radical for Little Miss Free Love Dennett. So I'm telling you guys, it's all just nuts. But Dennett, it seems, was against eugenics, as she was against its sort of neo Malthusian ideas of population control. But she herself, Mary Dennett, was in the minority here, right? Modern feminist writer Carol McCann has stated that she believes that the birth control movement was so tightly linked to the eugenics movement for three reasons. She says, quote, that it facilitated the framing of birth control as a public health issue, that it linked the agenda of reproductive health reformers, and that it helped to mask the sexual nature of the cause. End quote. Now, this is actually a very interesting admission here. It seems for Sanger, at least, her entire life's mission was to get birth control into the hands of women. That was her thing. Where Goldman was kind of an idealist, where Dennett was more focused on the litigious aspects, Sanger was a pragmatist, right? She wanted results and results now, law or no law. She was an advocate of getting these things out. And it's actually quite interesting because we found in recent years certain undercover videos from the organization that she founded. And it seems that it's actually very much their modus operandi today, that they don't actually quite care what's on the law books. If you go into one of their clinics and you say, I need this, if it's within their ideology, they are going to make sure that you have access to that law or no law. And as we have discussed, in the 1920s, eugenics is all the rage. It's being billed, though, as a public health concern. And that's where McCann's quote is actually quite fascinating. This is how the Eugenics Record Office, this is how the various eugenics retreats were selling the American people on the idea of eugenics as a public health crisis. Because you have to realize eugenics wasn't sold as a means to exterminate classes of people. It was sold as a way to end crime, to rid poverty, to rid the world of illness. It was a way that we could advance mankind and create new societies and new people. The human Rottweiler experiment. Now, despite the best efforts of her organization in recent years to whitewash its own histories, the fact is that Sanger herself bought the eugenics pill hook, line, and sinker, and she plunged down into the bottom of the lake. From Planned Parenthood's own write up of the topic, due in fact to pressures in recent years from minority groups forcing the American left, actually at times here recently, to own its own past, which I applaud minority groups for doing that. They should put the left's feet to the fire because the left's feet has been too propped up on the couch for too long. Planned Parenthood actually had this to say, quote, Sanger also believed in eugenics, an inherently racist and ableist ideology that labeled certain people unfit to have children. Eugenics is the theory that society can be improved through planned breeding for desirable traits like intelligence and industriousness. Margaret Sanger was so intent on her mission to advocate for birth control that she chose to align herself with ideologies and organizations that were explicitly ableist and white supremacist. In doing so, she undermined reproductive freedom and caused irreparable damage to the health and lives of generations of Black people, Latino people, Indigenous people, immigrants, people with disabilities, people with low incomes, and many others. End quote. Sanger fully endorsed Buck versus Bell, which was the direct cause of tens of thousands of minority women being forced into sterilization through hysterectomies and fallopian tube tying. So the challenge is dropped here, though, whether Sanger was exclusively a eugenist for the sake of creating the thoroughbred race, her terminology, without actually considering race as the factor. This is kind of what Planned Parenthood wants to say. Or was she, like so many others that we have spoken of in this series, of the opinion that the minority races were by default of their race a part of the groups that we want to be eliminated? Well, she worked closely with Harlemite W.E.B. Du Bois, himself a eugenicist, to introduce birth control movement into a very reluctant African American community. Now, for my fellow white listeners out there, I want you to listen closely. Along with my general interest in this period of the turn of the century at large, early 20th century history, right there in the middle of this, at one time I was really super fascinated by African American culture. And I mean African American culture, the culture within America of Africans. I loved the debates between like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois about how to advance the lives of African Americans in this country, the culture as it migrated around the United States after the war and the Reconstruction era, the music that developed out of all of this. I can speak to it actually quite a bit. I've been long interested in it. One of the things that many of my fellow white American friends fail to realize is that there is an inherent distrust in the African American community whenever white folk come in to help them, because like the Native American, like the North American Indians, so many times when these white do-gooders come in, they end up causing more harm than good to the communities. And the African Americans end up, one, on the receiving end of the policies of the do-gooders, and then two, being blamed for it when the policies end up failing, which they were ultimately destined to do to begin with because they were bad policies. Much of the Reconstruction era policies created by Northern whites, for example, led to serious recriminations and violence against African Americans in the South for policies that were created by whites. But the whites weren't the whites in the South or the whites in the North that forced the Reconstruction laws weren't the ones that ended up facing the brunt of the blowback, the retribution. It was poor African Americans in the South who faced it. So, as you could maybe, just maybe, if you sort of open your mind up to all of this, see why when white folk to this day come into an African American community with suggestions and idea, African Americans may be a little standoffish. You would be too if you had any common sense. So Sanger and her group comes in and says, hey, we want to open these clinics in your community. It's for your own good. Trust us. Malcolm X, a Harlemite himself, once said that the white liberal is the most dangerous animal on earth. The African American community of Harlem absolutely did not want these clinics coming in and encouraging their women to self-sterilize. So it's actually very, very, very controversial to this day within the African American community, the subject of birth control and abortion and the intent and purposes of these groups coming into the communities and forcing these one of the really interesting things that came out of the civil rights movement early on in the civil rights movement was this sort of self-realization of African Americans that, hey, these shops that are on the end of all of our corners, what are they? They're gun shops, they're liquor stores, they're, for the sake of our conversation today, sterilization clinics, and they're all run by folk that aren't from this community. So it's a self-realization. Go read the autobiography of Malcolm X. It's an absolutely wonderful book because he goes into this period right here, pre-World War II, and he was caught up in it all, right? He was caught up in the drugs and the prostitution of Harlem, and he was a pimp himself. But he has that period of self-reflection where he's like, look, at the end of the day, these people close shop and they go home and they leave our communities and they leave our women sterilized. They leave our men boozed up and drunk with guns to sort of kill each other. Well, whereas if you go to their towns and to their neighborhoods, at least at the time, white communities are sort of self-degrading today, but at the time you would not find those things in a white community. So there's a huge, huge, huge amount of controversy surrounding the contraceptive movements within the African American community. And as I suspected, I'm really kind of running out of time here. I'm going to have to make this go to another part because I've got somewhere I got to be. I'm going to have to pick it up next time, guys. I'm sorry. We will finish this. I promise we will finish this. I will get through it. But turning here right to the point of race and what Margaret Sanger starts to do next, I'm gonna have to do a next part on this. I was kind of hoping this would be the last, but let's see. Leader of the biggest Protestant church after the Second World War here in Czechoslovakia actually admired the USSR for its conservative attitudes towards sex. Yeah, but if you go back, it's what's interesting about this is that if you go back to the very early periods of the Russian Revolution, there were advocates. I mean, I can't say whether it's been so long since I've seen it, but Warren Beatty made a movie in the 70s about the American journalist John Reed, who travels over to Russia during it was called a famous book, infamous book that I guess you could say that he wrote was called 12 Days That Changed the World. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, he's the only American that's buried in the Kremlin. So that tells you who this character is that Warren Beatty, the movie's called Reds. Red or Reds, Reds, I think. And it's got Emma Goldman as a character while she's over there, and her becoming disillusioned with the direction that the Bolshevik movement's headed, because there was a lot of hope at the time that the Soviet Union, as it was being formed, would be the source of undermining, institutionally undermining marriage, because they went after the church and things like that. But yeah, by the time you get to Stalin, especially, Stalin is an interesting character. He's kind of this character where he wants to push forward many of the radical ideas of the revolution. I'm convinced that Stalin truly believed, and in many ways truly was, the logical heir to Lenin's ideology. But at the same time, Stalin came up against certain hard pragmatic realities that he had to face, because, for example, the Nazis, as they start coming into power, the Nazis' intended goal very early on in coming into power was an expansion to the east, pushing so that German people could settle basically where you are today, right? The German people wanted to settle Czechoslovakia and Poland and ultimately push into Russia. So Stalin signed that non-aggression pact with Hitler, which was a major, major turning point in the 20th century for the worldwide left, when Stalin signed that pact, because it showed just how pragmatic he was. But it wasn't without precedent, because if you go back to Lenin actually pushed through, and this isn't well publicized today. Lenin pushed through what was called the New Economic Policy in the 1920s. It's one of the last things that he did that was hugely controversial within the Communist International Movement, where there was so much mass starvation taking place in Russia at the time and in the Ukraine, that Lenin said, wait a minute, we actually have to release some of the privatization that we've done to the grain, so basically that the markets could open back up, and the people that were storing grain and hoarding it could make a profit. He called it the New Economic Policy. It was basically, he sold it as, we have to take two steps back, or we have to take a step back to advance communism two steps forward. But it was a huge upset and a blow to the worldwide left. And Stalin's the same way. And I also think too, by the time you get to Soviet Russia entering World War II, you really begin to see Stalin. He kind of opens. I think, I'm not quite for sure. Once you get to World War II, my history gets a little fuzzy, but I think he opens up the churches again. He really starts to sell the war effort as, protecting Mother Russia, right, and protecting our land. And that's where I think you really get to see the institutionalization of more conservative values within the Russian Revolution. But I think the damage had kind of been done, because the family had been completely undermined ideologically by the Bolshevik Revolution. So whether the USSR on paper was conservative or not, it's really, I mean, it's like I said, the demographics speak for itself. But anyways, guys, I got to head out. I'm running long here. I really appreciate all of you tuning into these. I am going to finish it next time, come high water or not. We'll probably just make it a continuation of this discussion of Margaret Sanger and her movement, because that really kind of, maybe we'll lead it right on up into our own day as best I can. But anyways, guys, God bless you all. Take care. I will see you next time.